If you've been participating in the daily Bible reading this year, then you've been reading through the life of Jesus. And I've been thinking recently about how those little snippets, these little views that we get into his life, teach us things about him. And we begin to get to know our Savior by reading those stories. There's one of those stories we just read in the last week or two. I don't really know what day it was. It talks about Jesus encountering a funeral as he's traveling along. You do that in your daily life, don't you? From time to time, you're driving down the road and you encounter a funeral procession coming down the road. I don't know about you, but I feel like I learn things about people when I sit there and watch that funeral procession go by. There are people who stop and respectfully bow. There are people who are obviously annoyed that the traffic has stopped and flail their arms around and keep creeping their car forward and trying to get around. We learn things about people when we see how they react in a certain situation. And we learn something about Jesus. In Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 11, it says, "Soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, 'Do not weep.' And then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. And fear seized them all, and they glorified God." Jesus is traveling with a great crowd, and he comes to this town. As towns were built then, they had a wall around it. They had a gate to keep the enemy out at night. And so as they approach this gate, which is going to be a congested area anyway, it's an area of commerce, everybody has to go in and out there. There's a large crowd going in, that's Jesus' crew, and there's a large crowd coming out. And it was obvious that there was a great deal of sadness. This woman was a widow, and her only son died. So you don't know what her life would have been like, do you? Not like today's world. She wouldn't have Social Security to carry her on. She's going to need help, and she's really upset. Jesus has compassion on her. Isn't that interesting? He knows about her life without being told, for one thing, and he has compassion on her. And he stops his crew and he walks over there, and you know the people that are his disciples have got to be wondering, oh, what's he going to do now? I can imagine they're thinking maybe we're going to be embarrassed. I don't know. And then he goes up to this woman who is weeping and says, "Don't cry." "What do you mean don't cry? I've lost my husband, I've lost my son, and you're telling me not to cry?" And then he walks up to the pallet or bier that they would have been carrying the body on, which was just more or less a flat surface with poles so they could carry it on their shoulders. And this dead man is laying there, and Jesus begins to talk to him. I don't know. I'm thinking if I'm a new follower of Jesus, maybe I'm sort of backing away from this scene. I don't really want to be associated with this. This is strange. But the dead man sits up. And can't you just feel the mood change in that street? I get a chill just thinking about it. I've never been at a funeral where somebody sat up in the casket. I've heard of it happening, but not because they were alive. And fear struck them all, and they glorified God. When I was reading this at home and contemplating people and the way we live, I was reminded of something that Beverly recently told us, that she used to have a customer that she would share her faith with and talk about her faith. And when she would talk about serving God, he would ask her, "What God? How do you know which God?" Obviously, there's a lot of gods. Which one are you going to serve? Well, there are many supposed gods. And the God that we worship is revealed in the stories, in the books, in this Bible. And we learn things about him by those stories. And so we can answer. If we just don't lose our cool and we think about those stories, I can tell you that the God that I worship is a God of compassion. He's a God that knows what I need in my life. He understands my trials and my fears and my thoughts and my worries and my pains. He knows all about those. And he has compassion for me. He sympathizes with orphans and widows, the people that are helpless to care for themselves. He sympathizes with them. And he can provide comfort in any situation. He can fix our problems. That's the God I serve. He created the world. He sustains the world. The world is maintained by his power. And when he's done with it, he'll destroy the world. That's the God I serve. He's a God that allows me to follow him or not follow him. He rewards good and he punishes evil. All these things we can learn from the stories in the Bible about Jesus. He shows us how to overcome evil. He has the power to raise people from the dead. And he proved that by resurrecting from the dead himself when they put him to death. That's the God that we serve. The gods that fuss with each other and fuss with mankind and go to war, that's not the God we serve. And if somebody's telling you about a God that does those things, that's not the God of the Bible. He doesn't struggle with death. He can control all physical and spiritual things. And he rewards good and punishes evil. That's the God that we serve.